Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Side Hustles and Stuff podcast, episode 4. My name is Yuri and I'm joined by Keishi.
Hey Yuri, how are you?
I'm good, Keishi. How are you today?
Not bad. What are we talking about today?
What are we talking about? We are talking about the 10 plus books that influenced our lives and side hustles. And this show is brought to you by the tea that I'm drinking and Keishi.
Same tea and water as usual.
And I got black coffee here as well. So this show is brought to you by tea, coffee, and of course, sidehustlesandstuff.com. If you want to get the notes for this show, go to Side Hustles and Stuff. That's the full word, sidehustlesandstuff.com/E4, where you'll find all the books and everything that we're going to talk about today. So, Keishi, let's move on. Why are we talking about books and why read books in the first place?
That's a good question, because I guess you could either go and say, stop reading books and start acting. But at the same time, if you have no information to act on, then you will just make a lot of mistakes. And I think books are a nice way to kind of learn from the mistakes of others and to just kind of be reminded of some of the principles of life or business in general, just by reading stories of others, whether they're fictional or non-fictional.
That's true. So you get a how-to essentially when no one else is there to teach you. You can kind of tap into the greatest minds present or past and find out how they did it, right?
Yeah, I think so. I find it fascinating because I think whatever you're doing in your life, or I mean, in terms of business, there's always things that you can kind of apply from other fields of, from other industries, I guess, so to say. And the easiest way that you can kind of see how people acted in certain situations and what outcomes it brought is by reading a bunch of books.
Actually, I have a love-hate relationship with books for this kind of similar reason. And it's because I've spent a lot of time reading and not acting. So it kind of eventually kind of started bothering me that all I'm doing is I'm consuming, and I'm not really producing. So I get a little agitated. I get a little impatient when I'm reading because I want to nowadays take more action.
That's interesting. I guess we kind of differ in the way that we see books, because for me, I guess if I want to take an action, I just go to Google and just search how to do whatever. And I think there's a lot of stuff on blogs and on YouTube and all around the web about kind of how to do different types of actions. And I more sort of view books as kind of sources of higher level. I'm not sure if learning is the right word for it, but just really kind of seeing how different people acted in situations that I've never been in before or that I will never be in, but that I think might have some sort of connection to what I'm doing, whether right now or like 2 years down the road. And I kind of find them like a nice balance between feeling productive, but at the same time, just relaxing in a way.
Yeah, I agree there. I definitely agree there. Because, well, you definitely would run into a lot of people who have read a lot of books, but that's where their intelligence kind of ends. They've read a lot about it, but they can't really do it themselves. And I definitely agree with you on that point. I also want to mention that for me, books are kind of like meditation or immersion into a topic. You know how you watch a TV show or a movie that you get so immersed in the story, you get so caught up in it that that's all you're thinking about. So I think books are a great way to get your mind right for a certain topic, especially if you've been reading a book for like the past 2 weeks or something. My only qualm with it is, this is just a personal qualm with myself, is if I spend too much time reading, not enough time producing, that's when I get a little cranky at myself. Because I don't want to be the guy that's like, oh, I have a wise quote for you, but I don't represent that quote and I don't do it.
Yeah, I think the last point is very important. And I think you're right in terms of if all you do is read books and then never did anything yourself, and then all you do is just spit out quotes from different books and just essentially take things out of context, because that's what you do at the end of the day, then I don't think it's really helpful. But I think if you use books to kind of augment your own stories rather than to replace your own experiences, then I think they can be really powerful. Like, let's say you do something and you say, I did A and I got a result B, as in you yourself did it. But then you also know a couple of different examples from books where if somebody did A, they got results B or C or D. Then it kind of opens up the different possibilities. And I guess it kind of makes you see a situation from a bunch of different angles rather than just from your very own. I think if used in the right way, they can actually augment what you know. Whereas if used in the wrong way, then you start thinking that you know just because you read about somebody.
Yeah, that's why for me, it's like, knows. In the past, I used to run through books. Nowadays, I'm taking my time because I want to apply what I learned. And what about you? Have your reading habits changed at all?
Yeah, I guess they did. I still buy a lot of books that I never end up reading. So that's one thing that didn't change at all, unfortunately. But I guess before I just used to just go through a book in a couple of sittings, essentially, without thinking about it too much. I'm still absorbing some of the information, but never kind of reflecting on the information for too long. And I guess that's also a function of, like, for quite a long time, essentially the only places where I read books were either on an airplane or at an airport or stuff like that. So it was more to pass time. But recently I've been kind of more systematic about reading books, I guess, and just taking notes. And in the past, I hated
I love doing
writing into books because I kind of felt like I'm destroying them. But yeah, nowadays I take notes in the margin and make sure to kind of go back to certain books and just look at what notes I wrote and which passages I liked and things like that.
That's actually one of my favorite thing to do with books, and why I don't like Kindle books as much is I like to write in the margin. I like to underline stuff. If I if I think something's funny, I'm gonna write LOL next to it. And it's always nice to, like, when you're rereading a book, you end up seeing old notes that you wrote to yourself, and that's always nice if you come across it years down the line. I was looking at one book and then I found a note to myself saying, "Hey, ask this girl out." I thought it was funny.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why I never liked Kindle. I bought Kindle like years back and then I gave it to my sister and never got another one since. And I've just been buying paperbacks and hardbacks every now and then. But I guess the nice thing is with Kindle, you can kind of highlight things and they kind of automatically transfer to your computer,
Yeah,
right?
but the highlighting itself is kind of clumsy.
I see. Okay. So we need something that's paperback, but then takes the paperback and automatically transfers the note. Because that's one of the things that I was kind of struggling with. Is I do all this underlining and just picking out passages that I like and things like that, and I'd like to have them in my Evernote or whatever. It's just a lot of work to type it up and things like that.
So Keishi, what about the books that you're reading now? And what are the most recent ones?
Yeah, so I guess the last book that I finished reading was called The Third Door, and I have it right here next to me. And it was written by a guy that I think when he did this, he was probably like 18 or 19 years old. And he essentially embarked on a mission of interviewing all the famous people in the world. So he wanted to interview like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Lady Gaga and George Lucas and whoever. But honestly, I think he was really bad at interviewing people. But it was still really great story in terms of the hustle he had. And I guess that's really relevant for the show since we're talking about side hustles and stuff. But yeah, he was really relentless in chasing the people. And in some cases, just way too much. And he kind of went overboard. Yeah, it was really good story of just how to set a goal and go after the goal. I don't think it was a really good story of how to interview people. I think he actually kind of acknowledges that. And I think the book is also intentionally written from the sort of point of view of it actually being the story of chasing the interviews rather than being primarily focused on the interviews themselves. Because a lot of the interviews weren't even interviews, I'd say.
The last book I read was A Whack on the Side of the Head. And I think you might be reading that now, right?
Yeah, I'm reading that now. And I'm probably like halfway through. But that's the other thing that I changed recently is before I tried to read one book at a time. Now I kind of try to read just 2 or 3 at a time, both for kind of variety and also because I find it kind of less stressful.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Because I don't feel pressured to finish this book just so that I can read the next one. But it's also a slippery slope, I guess. If I start too many books, then I will never finish any of them.
No. What do you have next on your shelf?
Yeah, so I'm reading A Wag on the Side of the Head right now, and The Richest Man in Babylon, which is like a set of parables about personal finance and building wealth and things like that. That's set in Babylon like thousands of years ago, and it's really fascinating how the system worked back then and how it works right now, and how it's at its very core, it's still the same thing. Like it's still the same set of rules and things like that. And then the next one in line is Atomic Habits by James Clear. I heard a lot of good things about it, and I haven't opened it yet, so I'm really excited to be reading that. How about you?
I'm reading Copywriting Secrets. I read a lot of books on copywriting because that's a lot of what I do at work. And on my shelf, next up, I have Save the Cat, which I started, but I've had to set it aside because I want to finish copywriting first. Save the Cat.
What's that one about?
Which one?
The Save the Cat?
Save the Cat is screenwriting, how to write scripts for movies. It kind of breaks down movie scripts into like templates in a way. Like, by minute 5, this has to happen. By minute 10, you have to introduce this. So, and, also how to like write a log line, I think it is like a very marketable line to sell the movie to people. It's like a one-liner that will describe, who the movie is about. It has to have some sort of, it has to say who the movie is about. It has to have some kind of ironic twist just to like pull the people in. This is what I'm reading. And next up, I also have I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi. And I have a whole lot of other books that need rereading.
That's great. You actually met the guy, didn't you?
Yeah, I have a picture. If anyone wants a picture, again, visit the website and leave us a comment. But it's definitely on my list right after I finish copywriting.
Yeah, heard a lot of good things about that too. And watching a lot of his content online, it seems to be a good guy with a good message, I think.
Yeah, it's also personal finance. A lot of things that I should be taking action on at my age.
So we need to do a personal finance episode.
Yeah, but I have to finish the book so I have something to talk about. Otherwise, I'll come empty-handed. All right. But today's episode, listeners, is something a little more deeper. It's about the books that have influenced us in the long term, in a grand scheme. And we're not talking talking about books like, 4 Hour Work Week, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or some other popular self-development, self-help book. Some of these are probably unusual to you. Maybe you've heard them, maybe you've not. But I think these, for us, at least for now, are books that kind of change the way we think, where we approach life, or maybe have changed our lives to some extent, right?
Yeah, I think so. And not mentioning the 4 Hour Work Week or Rich Dad Poor Dad or Think and Grow Rich, whatever other self-help or personal growth kind of books there are. It doesn't mean they're bad books, and we've read a bunch of them, and there's a lot of good books in that sort of category too. But in all sort of podcasts and blog posts that talk about books, they're just mentioned over and over again. So we just thought we'd add a bit more variety, and hopefully there's some books that we'll be talking about that you haven't heard about before, and that you'll be enticed to pick up at the bookstore and read.
Exactly. So should we start?
Yeah.
All right. So the first book for me, and this I read ages ago. It's called Ahead of the Curve by Philip Delves Broughton. The full title is Ahead of the Curve, 2 Years at Harvard Business School. And this was like back in New York. I was majoring in finance. I decided to study abroad in Tokyo. And on the trip, I ended up buying some business books because I guess I wanted to grasp my mind around what the hell I was getting myself into in terms of finance and where I was sending my life to. And this was one of the books that I read. And the reason for me it's so influential is basically, long story short, it is a journalist who attends Harvard Business School. That's just simply his experience there. But there was one paragraph that kind of stood out to me that I will still remember to this day. And it was about how they had some banking executive come in and talk to the MBA students there about core values that, you as a business person ought to have. But, and I quote, he had the biggest look of defeat on his face when it came time to talk about his personal life and that he was going through a divorce, or he was on a second or third failed marriage. And so that was what really stood out to me, and at which point I've kind of realized I don't know if I want to be like that. I mean, there are other books that I read on finance where I already realized I don't want to get into this stuff, but this book kind of cemented in my head, like, this book wasn't particularly about finance, but this book particularly communicated to me what I don't want out of life and what I do want out of life.
So you don't want to work 100 hours a week.
Exactly.
Am I getting that right?
And I don't want to have talk about business wisdom, right? And sound wise. But when it comes down to being wise in other areas of life, being a total failure. So that's what hit me hard. I guess I'm a product of a divorced family. So to me, it was a little personal and I didn't want that. And that's my first book.
Sounds like a good one. We'll definitely check it out. So starting with the first of mine, What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. It's been written by Tina Seelig, who's with the Stanford Technology Ventures program, and she's teaching entrepreneurship at the university. It's a really short book, and it's one of the first English books that I read, I guess, back when I was probably just a bit over 20. And it talks a lot about just the exercises she goes through with students when she's teaching them entrepreneurship and creativity, and like about the bunch of biases and things that people tend not to notice when taking care of problems. And just to mention a couple of them, like she was talking about problem blindness, which is just before there were ATMs, people couldn't even imagine using ATMs, or they couldn't even imagine that they would need ATMs. So there are certain problems that even the people that have them done are not aware of. And then she was also mentioning a study about lucky people, and that sort of resonated with me, which says the lucky people are more likely to take advantage of chance, and they pay attention to a lot of things that's happening around them. So essentially they look for whether it's announcements for events that are going to be happening, or whether it's a new neighbor moving into the neighborhood, or whether it's a colleague that needs help. They're just more likely to notice that, which in a way makes them luckier in many cases. And the third one is she talked about the difference between rules and recommendations. And I think that's a really powerful one, because when you actually look at whatever people are telling you that you should be doing, and you kind of separate it into two groups of rules that you really got to follow, and then recommendations that just people think you got to follow, then you realize there are very, very few actual rules, and it can kind of liberate your whole creative process, or your whole the way you look at your side hustle or whatever it is. So those are all good, but I think the most fascinating story for me was she's doing this exercise with her students where she gives a group of students an envelope with $5 of essentially seed capital, and tells them to turn it into as much as possible within, I don't know if it was a week or 2 weeks or whatever the amount was during the class. And as you would expect, some teams go and they start a car wash and buy buy soap and things like that using the $5. Other people buy umbrellas and then sell them on rainy days for higher price. And some people do lemonade stand, of course. That's kind of the classic in these sort of scenarios. But the most surprising thing is that the team that won, a team that actually managed to make $650 out of those $5, didn't use the $5 at all. So instead, what they realized was that the $5 were basically worthless, right? $5 is in many cases equal to $0. But what they realized was that the 3-minute presentation that they had at the end of the challenge in class was the most valuable part of what they had. And they essentially went to a company that wanted to target the students at the school, and they sold them an ad in the presentation for $650. So rather than doing anything with the $5, all they did was they just sold the 3 minutes they had to present as a commercial. And that was a really great example and a story of kind of how just switching the way you look at things just can bring up completely different solutions to a problem. And that was kind of my first encounter with this sort of thinking. And I think you'll agree since you read the book, but I think a lot of the content of A Veg on the Side of the Head is kind of similar to doing thinking experiments like this.
Yeah, I was thinking that it's exactly what I've been reading in that book.
Yeah, so that was my first book that I wanted to mention in this list. I think you've got a cool one coming up next.
So this is probably unusual for some of you guys. This next book is called The Tao of Pooh. And what it is it's Taoism, as you know, a philosophy, ancient Chinese philosophy, but told through the eyes of Winnie the Pooh and all the characters at the House of Pooh corner. And so Taoism is one of these concepts that's hard to grasp because by definition, you're not allowed to define Taoism because Taoism is the way. It is how the world works. And the moment you start to analyze it too much is when you start missing it. So what made this book very significant for me was just how we approach intelligence and how we approach life in a way. So there's one quote that stuck out to me. It goes, "It's rather significant that Pooh, rather than the thinkers, Rabbit, Owl, or Eeyore, is the true hero of Winnie the Pooh and the House at Pooh Corner, because Winnie just does things and they end up working. Whereas you have characters like Rabbit, Owl, or Eeyore who overthink things, but ultimately they really have nothing to bring to the table except for a lot of analysis."
So Winnie the Pooh is a side hustler.
Exactly.
He's just taking action.
Winnie the Pooh is the uncarved block. So, and there's another line that's quite clever. It says, "Rabbit's clever," said Pooh thoughtfully. "Yes, Piglet," said Piglet. "Rabbit's clever, and he has brain." "Yes," said Piglet. "Rabbit has brain." There was a long silence. "I suppose," said Pooh, "that's why he never understands anything." So, again, if you sit around and think too hard into it, you probably won't get anywhere. But so why this book has such impact on me is basically it had me rethink, I guess, intelligence in a way and just going about things. It's very hard to put into words, but it made me be more patient and more playful rather than just push and hammer out work. So if you're interested in ancient Chinese philosophy, Taoism, definitely check it out. It's very reader friendly, very approachable. And that's my third book.
And if you guess correctly how many times it took Yuri to say ancient Chinese philosophy properly, you get a free copy of The Tao of Pooh.
So be sure to visit sidehustlesandstuff.com. Get it right, win a free copy.
Okay, so number 4, and my second pick for this list is Business Trip Bear by Richard Branson. And I'm sure a lot of you guys know him, but he's a fairly successful or very successful British entrepreneur. Mainly he's known for founding Virgin Atlantic Airways, but he also started a bunch of different airlines and a bunch of different companies in a lot of different industries, which is also one of the reasons why I really enjoy following him. Because if you read his book, and especially his autobiography, or even this book where he kind of distills his autobiography into more sort of short and brief lessons, you realize that this guy's been having a lot of fun over the last probably 4 or 5 decades building different businesses. And he never was the type of person that you see be like a Wall Street executive, let's say. He's been the guy that kind of goes and cuts ties of ex-presidents and things like that, and just wants to enjoy life. And somehow he was just enjoying his life and just happened to make billions along the way rather than the other way around. So I think he's a really great example of, if you're not focusing on the business side too much in the beginning, it might oftentimes be better than if you just try to go after the money so hard that you kind of lose your direction. And my biggest takeaway from this book and also all the other books from him that I read is just, whether you're doing side hustles or whether you're trying to build a business or whatever you're doing, make sure you have fun. Because if you don't have fun, then what's the point, right? And also, one of his favorite phrases is "screw it, let's do it." And I think that kind of ties back to a lot of what we've been talking about side hustles so far in some of the previous episodes, and just taking action. And that's sort of a motto that I try to live by in many situations, even when trying to do my own projects. So, like, just to give you an example, I went to Iran a couple of times to fly on an old aircraft, and then I wanted to go again, but I didn't want to spend money. So I was thinking, oh, maybe I can take some people with me and do a tour. And then you kind of start thinking, what can go wrong? What can go right? And then at the end of the day, you just go, screw it, let's do it. And I did it, and I did it twice, and I got to go to Iran for free and have a lot of fun and meet a lot of cool people and even make some money along the way. So I really like kind of the philosophy of life and business that Branson's been teaching in his books and that he's been living.
All right. Speaking of well-known characters, the next book on the list is Total Recall. Can you guess by who? Total Recall was a movie.
Schwarzenegger.
Yes, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Total Recall is Arnold's autobiography. Let's see, I have the book on my desk right now. And it is close to 600 pages long. And this has to be my number one favorite autobiography, simply because of how much the guy did. Kind of like, in your case, like Richard Branson has tried a lot of things and got into many industries, corporate speaking, whereas Arnold did it on his own in a way. But so he went from a small town in Austria, he went into fitness and bodybuilding. He took bodybuilding into America. And after he won Mr. Olympia or Mr. World, I think, he moved over into acting. Well, at the same time, he already was buying businesses. He had a direct mail order business. He was owning property, buying houses. And, then there's acting. Acting was a big thing for him. And similarly, he had to take acting classes, accent removal classes. And with his success in the film industry, he also took that into politics. So to me, it was a very fun read simply because of how much the guy did. And this is why when we talked about earlier, I get a bit impatient with books sometimes when I'm reading about what someone else has done. For example, I've always felt it with Steve Jobs books. I'd be reading it and I'm like, all right, that's cool. He did that. And at some point I reach like a point where I want to put it down because I need to go do things myself, because that's the kind of mood that it gets me into. And that's why I really like the book. And just to give you some examples of Arnold wisdom, there's one about him going into a business deal and he said, "Don't tell me any more of this information. I like to always wander in like a puppy. I walk into a problem, then figure out what the problem really is. Don't tell me ahead of time." So this was him not wanting to know all the issues that he'd face if he invested in real estate. He'd rather just jump into it and figure it out later. And also he took his fitness approach and applied it everywhere else. So there's another quote. "All I would say is that I find joy in the gym because every rep and every set is getting me one step closer to my goal." And this really resonated with me because, as you know, Casey, I'm a big gym goer, although this pandemic is kind of, cutting into my gym time.
Well, you got yourself some stuff.
That's true.
Home, right?
I do have my dumbbells, but I really relate with this kind of work ethic, because in the gym is essentially every rep that you do, every set that you do gets you an inch and an inch closer. And I think the same concept applies to anything else that you do in life. It's effort and time over a long period of time. So that's why I like the book so much. And to me, it only makes me want to do stuff, which is why I like the book so much and why I admire Arnold.
Yeah, I love the quote that you mentioned last. And I think it's really important lesson in kind of in life in general. You have to take all the steps to get somewhere. And you were also mentioning some of the books about Steve Jobs and things like that. And it's easy to see those people and just be like, oh, they were overnight successes. But then I think the example with Schwarzenegger that you mentioned is really good. And in fitness, it's really visible and it's kind of really easy to visualize. It's you just have to take so many small steps along the way, whether it's building like a $5 billion company, or whether it's building like a $500 a month site, or whether it's getting in shape, or whether it's learning how to cook or whatever it is. You just have to take so many small steps along the way to get to the destination that sometimes it can be really hard because it can get repetitive, right? That's the very nature of the word you were saying.
Yeah.
Two, it's on kind of the micro scale. It's really hard to see the progress oftentimes. And I think you just got to keep going through that. Schwarzenegger seems like an amazing example of that.
Yeah. But in the case of fitness, I would argue that even though it's called a rep, people will disagree with me here, but reps are kind of, you do them, right? That's the whole working out. You put in reps. So for me, I don't see it as repetitive. I see it as, this is just me lifting the thing for the 10th or 15th time. But with each time, with each effort, with each step, you get closer and closer to your goal. And for me, this is also very personal because I've also been injured many times and I had to go to rehab many times for physical therapy. There was a point where I couldn't run because I had what was it called? Sacroiliac joint dysfunction. Basically a lot of hip pain and I couldn't run or walk. But with the therapy, like I had to be on a treadmill and I knew that with every step that I took, it was like a literal physical step. Every physical step that I took was a step closer to strengthening my muscles, loosening up whatever tightness that I had. Same thing with, foam rolling or rolling out whatever's tight. Every step that I took was one step closer to beating it. So for me, it's very personal and resonates a lot. So it's not about the work. It's just that you have to put in that extra step and that extra step. It's not about doing a lot of little things. It's more like let's start making steps and let's take a step ahead and one more step and one more step.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you got to realize that every step brings you closer to where we're trying to get, even though in the moment it might not seem like that because it doesn't bring any sort of immediate result.
Exactly. And speaking of steps, guys, if you want to take your step towards your own side hustle, if you want to create your own website or a blog, then you'll want hosting, for which we recommend Bluehost. So if you go to sidehustlesandstuff.com/hosting, we recommend Bluehost as a hosting service. Basically, you go there, you pick a domain name, you buy a domain name, you buy the hosting, and now you have a blog or a site going, and now you can put your project out into the world.
Yeah, so just sign up. It's just a couple of dollars a month and take your first step towards starting your side hustle.
Speaking of steps, let's step over to the 6th book, which is yours.
So number 6 is Jack by Jack Welch, and he used to be the longtime CEO at GE, at General Electric, and recently he passed away, but he left a long-lasting legacy at the company. And this one's kind of personal for me because, one, I used to intern at GE Capital for a couple of months back when I was at college, and it was a fun experience, and it was very valuable. And two, I once got a job at GE, but I never ended up taking it straight out of college. So I never ended up taking it, but I went through the interview process, and it was kind of nice to have gotten the job, even though I didn't take it in the end. But anyways, that's why kind of the book is personal to me. And the other reason is I think it's one of the very, very first business books that I actually read and that I read from cover to cover. Yeah, again, sort of similar to Richard Branson. I think he was just a very fascinating person in general, and he had a very remarkable career. Yeah, and there were a lot of stories of him just going through his life as an employee at GE and then later on as an executive at GE, where he made a lot of mistakes. And one of the ones where he made some mistakes along the way, and the one that probably stood out the most was he made the factory blow up because he messed up some chemicals or something. I don't remember the exact story, but essentially the factory has blown up. And as you can imagine, that's quite a mark on your resume, but he still made it to the CEO. So I think that's a really great example of just not being afraid to mess things up. And like sometimes it's better to take a risk and mess up than not to take a risk at all.
That's an incredible story.
And the other thing is, he was a big proponent of radical candor.
What do you mean by radical candor?
Just being very, very, like if somebody's not performing well, then you just be very straight on with them and tell them you're not performing well and kind of try to figure it out, of course. But I guess there's some people that just hate delivering bad news. And I was recently listening to I think it was a podcast or a video with Gary Vaynerchuk, and he was saying how he's really bad at, or he used to be really bad at kind of being honest with his own employees just because he likes them so much. And then it would kind of be like, oh, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're fired. And then the employee would be like, wait, what? Like last week you were telling me that I'm doing great. Whereas with Jack Welch, I guess he would kind of be very straight on and very straightforward from the very beginning and just tell somebody that, hey, what you're doing is not good, or you're not performing as well as you should be, but let's try to figure it out. Maybe there's a way that you can improve, or maybe there's something we can provide that will help you improve, or maybe you just gotta go and it's gonna be good for both of us.
Sounds like Gary really hurt a lot of people with that approach.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But yeah, those were kind of the two biggest takeaways for me, I guess. And again, I recommend reading the book, even though there's a lot of great stories from his career. And so I guess compared to Branson, he's more of like a Fortune 500 type CEO, since he was leading GE, of course. And I guess if Branson's about fun, then Jack Welch was about being serious about business. And I think it's important to kind of balance the two. So I think if you're looking for something to balance out the Branson's fun, then this is a great book to read.
All right, that sounds like a great read. So let's move on to number 7. I actually have 2 books. Again, I have 2 books here, but same author. And kind of like the Tao of Pooh, this also is philosophy. So the 2 books are Letters from a Stoic and On the Shortness of Life. The author is Seneca, and Seneca was an ancient Greek philosopher, and essentially Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy. And it's funny, kind of like Taoism on the East, you had Stoicism kind of budding on the West. Both were approaches to life and how to deal with the chaos of life and how to deal with it, essentially. So both are not really religions. They're more so methods of operation, or an operating system on how to deal with life. And the reason I got into these books was a few years back, my grandma passed away, and it was a hard time for me kind of processing everything and also dealing with a lot of other stress. And I guess that's why I became attracted to the books. I think I read from somewhere, heard from someone where they said that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of greats, like historical greats, they all had Seneca on their bedpost. So So I wanted to know what it was about, and I picked up the book. So Letters from a Stoic is essentially a collection of letters from Seneca to a pupil of his, and each letter is based around a certain topic. So one letter is on illness. Another thing is about being in a public eye. Another letter is sounding smart versus being smart, and versus, how to be a good person. And just a lot of these things really, I guess, help me deal with my own anxiety. I'll give you some quotes because right now it's all very airy, kind of hard for you to understand. For example, here's one. You will find no one willing to share out his money, but how many does each of us divide up his life? People are frugal in guarding their personal property, but as soon as it comes to squandering time, they are most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be stingy. Here's another one. You will notice that the most powerful and highly stationed men let drop in which they pray for leisure, praise it, and rate it higher than all of their blessings. At times they long to descend from their pinnacles, if they can in safety, for even if nothing external assails or agitates it, high fortune of itself comes crashing down. And Seneca was, I believe, an advisor to Roman Emperor Nero. And then you have another Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius, that also became a bit of a Stoic. So the whole point is that these books kind of provide an operating system to how to deal with life, how to let things pass. A lot of it is negative, for example, realistic visualization. One thing that the Stoics did in the morning is that they would write up a journal of all the things that can go wrong throughout their day, what they will do. And as a result, the day is a lot easier because a lot of what they thought would happen either didn't or they already prepped for it. That way, life kind of has no things to surprise you with because you kind of know what's coming anyway.
Yeah, I think the last one's really interesting because I think when you look at whatever project you're working on and you just start imagining what's the worst thing that can happen, then you automatically sort of start preparing for that. And then you also know that even the worst thing that can happen is really not that bad. And I think it can be really motivating to sort of go through the exercise of imagining what the negative side of something can be.
Exactly. And if you imagine it, at least you're prepared for it, right? So when it comes, you won't have that shock of, oh no, this is happening. It's like, well, I guess I kind of knew. And you can deal with it in a more rational way. On that side of things, I also recommend The Daily Stoic as a podcast and a few more other books. But the reason why I took to these books so much is that, life is chaotic. A lot of things that it's outside of control. And that's where philosophy, I think, comes in. Philosophy is how you see, how you approach, and how you live life. And I kind of relate with Stoicism, and I definitely like Taoism to that extent. So instead of just going on religion and a magic genie up in the sky, it's more so of actual practical advice that you can take.
Sounds great. It's quite deep reading that you've got on the list compared to some of my books.
Actually, no. I'm a little ashamed to say that these books are so deep that I can't that I have to reread them, and I can't go into as detail as you can with yours because I'm just I read these books years back. They've definitely had a profound impact on me, but I'm not really pulling up as much straws as you are.
Yes, it sounds like they're also great books to just read over and over again, though. It sounds like every time you read them, you find something new.
Yeah, I have definitely. This is one of the books that I've read through, underlined, and I have so much notes in there. There's another one off the top of my head that I'm remembering. It's what's the point of reading all these books? Whereas the better approach is to focus on one. Otherwise, it's like eating too many things at once. You're only going to vomit. But if you digest one thing and you focus on it, that presents you with more value. That was another lesson somewhere in there.
That's an interesting one. I think that one can be argued either way, probably, but I think it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Definitely. So if you're looking for philosophy, if you're looking just ways to see life a little differently through all the chaos, especially going on with the pandemic and the quarantine, I definitely recommend Stoicism. Stoicism is mostly about resilience and learning how to deal with obstacles.
Awesome. So let's go to the next one, I guess.
Next one is yours, E-Myth.
Yeah, so the E-Myth, written by Michael Gerber. And once again, I hope I'm not butchering his name and hope I'm pronouncing it right. But out of probably all the books that I listed here, this is probably the most practical one, maybe aside for the Tina Seelig one. And out of the books that I listed here, it's also the one that I read the most recently. And all it's about is just about systemizing a business. And I think it's really hard to tell a book impacted you within a couple months of reading it, because you kind of have to process it and then you have to put it into action and then you have to realize that it actually was you can kind of trace it back to that book. But I think this is one of the books where you can actually read it and apply it right away and get results immediately. And what it's talking about essentially is just about treating a business as even if it's a one-man business, and especially if it's a one-man business, treating it as if you're building a franchise. So just documenting everything and making sure there's processes for everything, and making sure that you're not just flying by the seat of your pants. Yeah, so he takes the reader through an example of a lady that's trying to run a cake shop. And that story is a bit cringeworthy in many cases, I'd say. But overall, the book has a lot of good examples on building systems and on kind of standardizing how things work. And one exercise that I think was really great in the book is just imagining the business that you want your business to be and kind of just drawing up the whole organization chart and how is it going to work and what are the different team members, and then working back towards where you are now. Because the thing is, even if you're a business of one, you still sort of need to fill like 20 different roles. So if you're running a blog, you need to be the editor, you need to be the writer, you need to be a designer, you need to be the web developer, you need to be the marketer.
Or you can skip some of those roles.
You can, but you still have to take care of all those things. And then essentially in the beginning, it's you wearing all those different hats, but just by acknowledging in the beginning that there's different hats to wear and just knowing what the different hats are, it just makes it that much easier down the road to just take one hat and put it on somebody else's head, right? It just makes it so much easier to just outsource part of your business when everything's nicely documented and you know who is responsible for what, which role is responsible for what. And I think it's really been helpful in terms of me getting much better with kind of working together with writers or working together with like a virtual assistant and things like that. And just by creating like really detailed instructions and really easy to understand instructions rather than kind of, and we talked about this in some of the previous episodes too, but rather than being kind of like, oh, I need you to do this, please do it, and not giving any sort of instructions, right?
Yeah. Didn't I tell you to read that book?
I think I heard about it in a podcast, but I think we might have chatted about it too. But yeah, definitely a book I recommend reading if you're thinking of starting a side hustle, and two, especially if you're thinking of starting the side hustle and then taking it to the next level where you either have different people doing different things for you or you kind of want to grow it into something bigger than just something that you on the side. And just to give you like a really practical example, he was talking about this hotel where they had a manual for each room. So the level of detail for the instructions and things like that we're talking about is the hotel had like, let's say 6 rooms, and each of them was laid out slightly differently, right? Which also meant that in each of the rooms, if it was a brand new cleaner, let's say, she'd have to go in or he'd have to go in and kind of relearn the room from the very beginning. But they essentially had a folder for each room with the exact layout and the map of the room and kind of like 1, go here and do the bed, 2, go here and make sure the trash can's empty and things like that. And it was really, really step by step, and it really, really helped deliver a consistent experience to the customers. So I think it's good for the customers as well, but it's also good for you in terms of being able to just take this folder and hire any person and just give them the folder and they can run with it and do a perfect job. And essentially what he was saying is that a lot of businesses are not built on the smartest people in the world, because those are also the most expensive and the most difficult to hire. But a lot of businesses are built on just simple people doing simple things, right? But if you want to do that, you really need to document things well, and you really need to have your processes nailed down. And I think the book really does great at kind of driving that point home.
All right. So my last book, I'm starting to notice a bit of a trend here between your books and my books. My books are more so, I guess, philosophy based. So the next one is number 9, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And this is a very heavy book. It's Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychologist in World War II. He had the choice to leave for America. And I think it was leave his family behind or stay or get sent into a concentration camp with them. So essentially he chose to stay. And his book documents that. Eventually, of course, he was freed and went on to the States to write the book. But the whole book documents his experience there, along with all the other, you could say, prisoners. And I guess one big takeaway there is that he made between the people that survived and the people that didn't, all other things aside, because of course, a lot of things were not up to them. You know, some were gassed and shot. But all other things aside was how many people clung and hung on to hope was the key differentiator. People that had something to look forward to were the ones that are able to survive until the end. So the key takeaway there was definitely you have choice of how you choose to look at things, and his was the most extreme choice. And I lent that book to someone, but I don't remember who. Someone has it still, so I never got a chance to reread it.
So if you're listening to this and you have Yuri's book, please return to the owner.
Please return the book to the owner, because I kind of want to reread it. Again, if you're looking for something, for a bit of guidance in life or a new way of looking at things, I think this one was the most interesting one.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. It really sounds like you're reading much more heavier books than I do, I guess.
All right, so those are our top books that kind of influenced us. But there's still many more great books out there, right, Keishi?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of books worth noting. And I think if we redo this podcast in a year or in 2 years, I think the list is going to change, just because I think it takes a while until you realize that a book that you read has actually influenced you, especially when it's something more less actionable, like some of the philosophical stuff or like some of the biography stuff, whereas something like The Imit might influence you right away. A lot of the books are I think a lot of the books take a longer time to influence you. So the list might be very different in a year than it is now. But I think just to mention a couple more books that I think are worth noting, even though they didn't make it into the list, some that I read in the past, I definitely say Elon Musk by Ashley Vance, I think. It was a biography of Musk. And in many ways, I think Musk is similar to Branson because they all kind of go into different industries. And that's what sort of fascinates me about Musk as well. And he's doing a lot of cool stuff. And the biography was just a lot of fun to read and very inspirational. The other one, The Promise of a Pencil. It's a book about a nonprofit called Pencils of Promise that's building schools in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And there's a great story of a guy that used to work at Bain, I believe, that has quit his job and go on to build this nonprofit. And this book sort of details his time spent on the nonprofit, and it's a really great story, especially about sort of the part of the life where you shouldn't really care about money, but also care about the good that you're doing. And 3, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. So one of the guys that started PayPal. And that's just the book about the difference between taking something from, as the name suggests, from 0 to 1 versus growing something from 1 to 100, let's say, and just how different the principles are that you have to kind of keep in mind. So that was a really fascinating read on just starting things up from scratch. 4, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And that's just about how companies disrupt incumbents. And usually the ones that disrupt them are kind of the companies that the incumbents are looking down upon. And they're the companies, let's say like Kodak, that goes, oh, digital cameras are never going to be big. And then before they realize it, they're dead because they never invested in digital cameras and just stuck with film. So that's kind of a nice study of how disruption works. And finally, 5, The Four by Scott Galloway. And that's just the fascinating story about how Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple came to essentially rule our lives and just affect pretty much every single facet of it. And I highly recommend reading it. It's pretty eye-opening. How about you? I'm sure you have some other books as well.
For mine, I have a I have a long list to reread. I have 2 authors, Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene. Ryan Holiday is 3 books. Ego is the Enemy, The Obstacle is the Way. Both are very Stoic based. Both have been in the media actually a lot. A lot of sports teams have taken on to Ryan's books. Again, going back to Stoicism and just like learning how to deal with chaos. Stillness is Key is his most recent book. And I think I mentioned it in a previous podcast, basically on how historical leaders and business leaders used free time, leisure time to their advantage, and how you need stillness in life to collect your thoughts. Then you have Robert Greene, 48 Laws of Power and Mastery. I reread 48 Laws of Power quite a bit. I really liked it, but I don't want to put it in my top because my thought is that when you attempt to define or set in place that there are these 48 laws of power in life, and the moment you start looking through life through these 48 laws of power is when I think life becomes unnatural. For example, there's one chapter on don't outshine the master, where if you're working for someone, you should always make them smarter than you. Or there's also one like never get attached to anything. Of course, he backs up all of these rules with like historical examples of warlords or politicians or businessmen who applied these or have failed because they failed to apply these. But the whole point is that if you are looking at life through these lenses, I think you're going to become very manipulative and just very unnatural type of person. If the chapter says never get attached to anything, imagine how terrible of a person you would be if you never got attached to anything and you played solo. Life isn't a solo game. So I like the book only because the stories in there are fascinating, but I don't want to approach life with these kind of 48 specific ones. So for the stories, it's very fascinating. And Mastery was another Robert Greene book where he goes into masters like Charles Darwin and a lot of like greats in their own professional fields and how they end up getting there and what kind of deliberate practice that they did. So again, very interesting stuff. You just want to read on how other people did it. So those are, I would say, my 5 books that are noteworthy, but I wouldn't quite place them on the list quite yet.
I think what you said about 48 Laws of Power kind of applies to all the books and sort of brings me back to What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20 by Tina Seelig, where she was talking about the difference between rules and recommendations. And I think it's very important to realize that whatever book you read, 99% of the time, it's just a recommendation. It's not a rule, unless you're studying unless you're studying law or something. But a lot of the times it's just recommendation. And I think just reading them and looking at your life through the lens of that book is good, but don't take it as something that's just fixed. Just take it as a suggestion and just think about how it might benefit you, but at the same time, don't be too attached to it, I guess, or too attached to the idea that's presented in the book.
Yeah. And 99% of the time, it's also made up by the author. So you're kind of taking the author's thinking without really examining if they're right or wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to think about it this way. I think a lot of books, especially when it's a biography or something, it's essentially taking like 20, 30, 40 years of the author's lifetime and compressing it into 200, 300 pages, which I think is really amazing because it just gives you the chance to essentially relive the life of the author in like a few hours that it takes to read the book. But at the same time, you got to realize that if you're taking 20 years and compressing them into something that can be read in 6 hours or 10 hours, then there's probably a lot that's left out. And a lot that's kind of taken out of context. So I think that's something you have to always be wary of, and especially when you try to read a book and apply it to your own life.
Yeah.
Just always make sure to think about what the things that have been left out are, besides just what's actually in the book.
I remember when I was younger, when I first came across this book, 48 Laws of Power, I was, I guess, in my early 20s. It was a very fascinating read and still is. But because I was young and dumb, I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, these are the 48 laws that I can kind of see these in real life. But again, the thing is, like, the moment you attempt to see life through a very specific sort of lens is when you start screwing up. And that's when life isn't as simple as some of these books make it out to be, and you can't really compress things into one. This is the one and only way.
Exactly. Life isn't as simple as some of the books make it seem. I think that's a really good point to end the podcast. I think if it really were that simple, then I think we'd all be millionaires or billionaires living on a Caribbean island that we own, like Branson does.
Exactly. So the reason why we're talking about books today is, still books are a powerful source of information. They kind of serve as guideposts for us on the way to whether it's our side hustle or it's life, but they are not the end all answer. But it's still, they give us an opportunity to tap into someone else's mind, whether you want to tap into a business genius, a philosopher, or someone from a completely opposite life experience than you. Then those are great ways to get in touch and to see life from another perspective. But they're never the right answer. Usually the right answer comes from you and your own life experience.
Exactly. If somebody says they did A and they got result B, just make sure you also look at how their situation that they began in was different from yours, so that you can kind of adjust their strategies to whatever might actually work for you rather than just copy them.
Exactly. So guys, again, if you want to start your own side hustle, be sure to visit sidehustlesandstuff.com/hosting, where you can get a great deal on the Bluehost service, where you can start your own website and start putting your work out into the world. So visit sidehustlesandstuff.com/hosting.
Thanks for listening. I think that's it for today's episode.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Side Hustles and Stuff podcast with Yuri and Keishi. Talk to you later.